Status effects in Monster Hunter have a long and storied history, and at times have felt somewhat underutilized. Whether it be status inflicted by the player, or status inflicted to the player, these effects have many different variations and gameplay impacts. Today, let's talk about status effects in Monster Hunter throughout the series, and how they could change in the future. Status inflicted by the player has actually changed relatively little over time. A weapon with a status effect on it will occasionally cause a small amount of buildup of that status on hit, depending on the listed status buildup value. Once enough has been built up on the monster, it will proc the status for a while. Every monster has their own resistance to each status effect that affects how long the status lasts, how much buildup it takes to proc the status, how fast buildup decays between landing hits of it, and how much damage it deals. Every time you proc the status, the monster's resistance will go up, so it becomes progressively harder to proc the effect multiple times. Back in Monster Hunter 1, the only status effects the player had access to were poison, paralysis, and sleep. These could be afflicted by multiple different melee weapons, via bowgun ammo, and by items such as throwing knives or poison smoke bombs. There was actually a funny interaction in Mon Hun 1 with poison, where once you afflicted a monster with it, further hits of poison would actually extend the duration of the effect, allowing you to essentially keep a monster poisoned indefinitely throughout a quest. This was most likely a bug, but it is something you can take advantage of. Paralysis and sleep had no other effect beyond immobilizing the monster for a time. You may be familiar with a damage modifier being granted by them, such as the wake-up hit on sleep, but that was not in Mon Hun 1. It was a later addition. With that and the uneven distribution of status on weapons, it meant status effects felt more like a minor utility that was mostly the job of bowguns to deal with. Later on, Monster Hunter would add additional status effects for the player to inflict. Most notably would be the stun or KO status. This was originally predominantly the domain of the hammer. Blunt attacks to the head of a monster would build up stun and eventually would cause the monster to become immobilized for a time. This would of course apply to other blunt damage sources such as the hunting horn as well, but I think even to this day, stun is associated most strongly with the hammer and considered its main niche. 3 Ultimate added the slime status, the signature status of Brachydios. Originally only available on Brachydios weapons, and a few other via Hidden Element Awakening. Most people know this as its later name, Blast. Slime or Blast work much the same as other status, except when you proc it, it deals an instant burst of damage. Slime was considered very strong in 3 Ultimate due to how easy it was to proc on most monsters, and how much damage it did. The weapons that inflicted it were often considered the strongest in the game. Later on in 4th Gen and beyond, this would of course be more balanced out, and Blast would become a standard status associated with more monsters and available on many more weapons. That was the last time Monster Hunter saw any new player-inflicted status, but that's not the end of the status story. Monsters also have their own statuses they can inflict, and it's a whole different realm from how player status works. Monster status does not obey the same rule as player status. Players do not have resistance. Any hit from status inflicting attack will immediately inflict the status on you, and this will happen every time you are hit by that attack. The only way to avoid this is with armor skills, that reduce or negate the effects of harmful statuses. Player and monster statuses have some commonalities, of course. They can also inflict poison, paralysis, blast, and sleep. Sleep has seen some changes over time. Originally, you would just fall asleep, but eventually they added items like the energy drink that would allow you to avoid falling asleep. At this point, there would be a small delay where you would be in the falling asleep state, where you would have a chance to use an item before actually fully succumbing to the status. In the absence of carrying items for it, this delay before the status takes effect could also allow you to go run into a small monster, or perhaps a friend, who can hit you and clear the status. But beyond those, monsters have many and various other statuses they can inflict, such as Defense Down, which does exactly as it implies. Your defense is reduced, making you take more damage. This can be a very devastating status to be afflicted by because it leaves you extremely vulnerable to follow-up attacks, where attacks that were previously not lethal at full HP become one-shot attacks. It's often inflicted by monster spit and fluid attacks, and is cured by using armor skin items. Variations of poison also exist for monsters. The deadly poison and fatal poison effects. These simply drain your health much faster than normal, and still act much like the usual poison effect, being able to be cleared by antidotes. Deadly poison is often inflicted by G-rank versions of poison monsters or poison variants. Fatal poison is only used by Dread Queen Rathian and Deadeye Yan Garuga from Generations Ultimate. One of my favorite statuses, I say through gritted teeth, is the Confusion status. This status works by inverting your controls. If you push right, you go left, and so on. Unless you are very quick to adapt to the new controls or have an item to cure it, this can be a very detrimental status because it basically makes you unable to control your character properly to avoid attacks. Perhaps it's a small mercy that this is the signature effect of Malfestio, so no other monster has access to it, and due to Malfestio only existing in one game, it's not something you can encounter easily. However, I would not be surprised to see it come back either with Malfestio or on a new monster. And this is really only scratching the surface of monster-inflicted statuses. You have the Snowball status, inflicted by many snow monsters in the older games, which reduces your mobility and makes you unable to attack, cured by Cleanser, mashing the stick, or getting hit out of it. There's Bleeding, which deals increasing amounts of damage the more actions you take while inflicted by it, like moving, rolling, and attacking. It's usually inflicted by sharp monsters like Seregios or Odogaron, and can be cured either by crouching down for a while or using a meat item. You also can't discuss status without talking about one of the more unique ones like Frenzy Virus, the signature status of Gore and Shigaru Magala, though also inflicted by frenzied monsters. This status has multiple stages to it. On initial hit, there's no negative effect. Instead, you gain a bar next to your name that will slowly fill over time, and fill faster if you take more frenzy attacks. Once the bar fills, you'll become inflicted with the virus and lose your natural health regen along with taking extra damage. However, if you were to deal a certain amount of damage before the virus takes effect, you will instead cure yourself and gain an affinity buff and become immune to the frenzy virus for a while. As an aside, I kind of feel like the frenzy virus is an underexplored design space. It was added back in 4th gen, and it's still the only status of its kind in the series. They've never done anything with a similar effect or style again. I think it's a really fun type of gameplay that it encourages, so I would like to see more statuses like it someday. There's also Elemental Blights, of course, which I think fall under the umbrella of status effects. These are statuses associated with each element that a monster can inflict with their elemental attacks. Burning damage over time for fire, stamina recovery reduction from Water Blight, increased chance to be stunned from Thunder Blight, increased stamina consumption from Ice Blight, and nullification of elemental damage from Dragon Blight. Curing these effects varies, but some can be cured by simply rolling a few times, while others need to be cured by a Nullberry, although I believe Rise might have made it so you can cure all of them by rolling. We could be here all day if we wanted to also talk about all the Frontier exclusive statuses that monsters can inflict on you. Shout out to Magnetism though, put Ruko Diora in the main series. So you might be noticing by now that the difference between player-inflicted status and monster-inflicted status is quite large. Monsters have a much larger variety of negative effects they can inflict upon you than what you can do to them, and theirs are often much more detrimental than what your status does to them. I've always felt that player-inflicted status is somewhat underutilized and underdeveloped. I wouldn't be surprised if there are players who have just never really used status before, and just stick to element and raw damage options. There are cases where status is made to be the correct answer against a monster, like Poison against Kushala Daora, but those tend to be exceptions that are few and far between. Most often, the correct answer is to just do the most damage to the monster, and the effects of status don't really meet this condition. I find this to be odd, because the foundation for expanding the usage and functionality of status is kind of already there in the game. Status as a concept is really about filling a sort of supportive role, ticking the monster's HP down over time, paralyzing it to give a damage opportunity, and so forth. I would contrast this with Hunting Horn, which is also a supportive role as a dedicated weapon, but Hunting Horn has many different buffs it can offer to a team: attack, defense, healing, resists to damage and status, antidote, wind pressure resist, earplug, sonic bombs, sharpness increases, divine protection, the list goes on. The amount of effects the player can support the team with on Hunting Horn massively eclipses what you can do with status. I think this gap could theoretically be easy to fill when looking at what monsters can inflict on the player. A simple place to start with would be, why do monsters inflict elemental blights with all of their elemental attacks, but hunters don't? This mechanic actually already exists in Rise via the Blight Beetles and Wyvern Rides. With these mechanics, you are able to inflict the blights upon the monsters, so there is precedent for it. It would of course be too much if you could inflict these blights with your attacks easily. They could use a similar build-up system to normal status effects, where landing enough hits would proc the effect. Although I think it would be fitting if inflicting them over the course of a hunt was slightly more common than statuses like poison or paralysis. Since they're elemental-based attacks, it would be sensible for monsters of that element to be immune to the effect entirely, and maybe monsters that are explicitly weak to that element could have the effect either proc more often or be stronger than normal. For example, a monster weak to fire could have the effect also act as a sort of minor stun, where they stop attacking you and attempt to shake off or roll the fire off of them. The most obvious way to improve status, I think, would be to bring over some of the monster-exclusive statuses and give them to players. However, this would likely be more complicated than bringing over the elemental blights. While elemental blights could just be attached to existing elemental weapon trees, new effects would need to be attached to weapons that didn't previously have them, or entirely new weapons for these effects would need to be added. I can't think of any reason why the higher tiers of poison couldn't be given to the player, or perhaps added to the base poison effect. Like if you proc poison and then get subsequent procs while the monster is still poisoned, it worsens the effect and causes them to take even more damage. Defense down is a status that I think would be really interesting for the player to inflict. I think it would be fitting to add to some typically raw damage weapon options as a sort of armor break effect. I don't think it should apply to the whole monster when it procs, causing you to generally deal more damage to them for the duration. I think that would be kind of boring. I think instead it should leverage the hit zone mechanic, and cause the effect to proc only on the single hit zone that it hits, essentially creating a special weak point for the team to try to cash in on while the status is in effect. I think this would not only create a sort of raw damage support niche role, but also add a pretty fun element to multiplayer team play. Bleeding is a status effect that I've always been somewhat surprised has never been able to be inflicted by the player. It feels like something that would just make sense as something you could inflict on a monster. I think something to avoid when adding more statuses is to not just have them boil down to dealing damage or like a poison analog. They should have some unique effect, or at least some mechanical aspect attached that differentiates it. Bleeding is one that I think would be easy to essentially just become a second poison effect, so instead I think I would also utilize the hit zone mechanic once again. While bleeding could deal a small amount of damage over time as a standard effect, if you were to proc it on a limb or a wing, it would cripple that part temporarily, preventing them from using it effectively, either slowing them down, stopping them from flying, or weakening their attacks with that part. Having effects like bleeding and defense down be able to be used as players in this way would really accentuate party play, I think, and bring status to the forefront as a support option similar to the Hunting Horn. While the Horn can buff players, the status weapons can debuff the monster, and create powerful and unique opportunities for the team to take advantage of. There are some changes I would make to existing player status as well. Paralysis is the big one. I feel that the effect of paralysis has been made somewhat obsolete and weak in the newer games. Once upon a time, a status effect that could temporarily immobilize a monster was quite strong. However, nowadays, there are a surplus of powerful ways in which you can topple or otherwise immobilize a monster and create a damage opening. The paralysis status tends to come with a fairly hefty reduction in the weapon's damage dealt, and in the modern day, this trade-off really isn't very worthwhile. Rather than paralysis being a single event that happens briefly when it procs, I think giving it a more persistent effect would be more potent and unique. For a certain duration, the paralysis would have a chance to inhibit the monster's attacks. When going for certain attacks and actions, the paralysis could momentarily stun them and interrupt the attack. This would only be a chance for it to take effect on any given action, so it's not something you could rely on, or something that would entirely neutralize the monster's threat, but it would provide a minor utility over a longer duration. Now, some might be thinking, the devs have already buffed status in recent games. Skills like Foray exist, And this is true in a sense. Skills that increase the effectiveness of status or in some way combo off of status procs have been added to the series recently. But I think this is kind of the wrong way to go about it, because it really just boils down to using status as a vector to directly increase player damage dealt. I think adding new statuses, changing how they work, and accentuating their utility results in a much more interesting playing field. A lot of these changes and new statuses I proposed would be a major shift in the power and effectiveness of status, and the game would need to be balanced around them. If they were just slotted into the current game, some of them would probably be fairly game-breaking, so only think of them within the context of a game that is designed for them to exist. Status has always occupied a weird space in the series, I feel, and has only gotten increasingly sidelined with time. I think an overhaul to status effects is overdue, and would be a great place for a new game to make some exciting changes to the fundamental mechanics of the series. But what do you think? Do status effects need changes? What kinds of new effects would you like to see? Is status actually fine as it is? Let me know in the comments. Thanks as always for watching. See ya.